This is the Leica Q2, a digital full-frame mirrorless camera by Leica that has a built-in Sumilux 28mm f1.7 lens. There is a ton of hype around this camera, and let's just say this right off the bat. This camera is not for everyone, but you already knew that. We're talking about a Leica. I want to make it clear that this isn't a review on the Leica Q2. This is just my first impressions of using this camera for street photography. There's plenty of other review videos out there on YouTube already, but I wanted to see what all the hype was about, so my friends over at Borrow Lenses were able to send me a rental unit to try out the Q2. Speaking of which, today's video is sponsored by Borrow Lenses, but more on them later. The lens on the Leica Q2, the Sumilux 28mm, is arguably the main selling point of this camera. In fact, a lot of people would argue that this lens is worth just getting this camera for. And it makes sense if you look at what Leica's closest available option for the digital M lenses. The cost of this camera and lens combo actually seems like a really good deal in the Leica ecosystem, of course. So I honestly think that this lens is going to be the ultimate deciding factor for anyone purchasing a Leica Q2. You either want to shoot with this lens or not, and that's going to really factor in whether or not you pick up a Leica Q2. Now, Leica lists this as a 28mm, but I've used a bunch of 28mm lenses in the past, and this actually feels a little bit wider. It's somewhere in between a 28 and a 24, but doesn't feel like a 28. Now, this isn't something a little bit of cropping and lens correction can't fix, but if you market something as a 28mm, it should feel like a 28mm. Now, personally, I don't really use a 28mm all that much for street photography, so that's reason enough for me to not really want to go out and purchase a camera like this. And it's worth bringing this up because 28mm is not for everyone. I've heard from a lot of previous Q2 or Leica Q owners that they moved on from the camera because they grew tired of that wide focal length. So I think it really makes sense for someone to buy this camera if they really like shooting 28mm. So for those of you thinking about purchasing a Leica Q2, I highly suggest you get your hands on one before going out and buying one, whether that's borrowing your friend's Leica Q2, seeing it in the store, or renting it for a week or so to see how you like shooting with it. If you do decide to rent, today's sponsor, Borrow Lenses, can help with that. Borrow Lenses is trusted by hundreds of professional photographers, filmmakers, and enthusiasts when it comes to renting gear for a particular project. But renting camera gear can be a really useful tool for anyone thinking about, making a big camera purchase. Be it a lens, a camera, lighting, or production gear, Borrow Lenses likely has that piece of gear that you need. It makes the entire renting process really easy. It took only 2 days for my Leica Q2 rental unit to show up, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it show up in this Pelican case. A return label and return instructions were also super easy to follow. Borrow Lenses allows for rentals up to 90 days. So the next time you're thinking about making a camera purchase, consider renting the gear out first with Borrow Lenses. You can use the code Faisal for 20% off your first rental. had a lot of high expectations for this camera. And one of those high expectations was for the image quality. And I can definitely say that hasn't disappointed. The Leica Q2 has by far the best looking image quality out of any camera I've ever used. And I'm not really much of a pixel peeper, so take that for what it's worth. You don't really notice the image quality using the camera when you're out, shooting street photography with it. But when you upload these 47 megapixel images to your computer, when you start working with these images, you really see the power of this lens and camera. With all this resolution, I also found myself cropping a lot of images, but I also tried out the digital zoom feature, which adds a crop to your images, and the quality was still very usable. I'll talk more about this digital zoom feature later on in the video. Now, I've heard a ton about this Leica look, and whatever that is, I did my research, and for what I've gathered, it's mostly to do around shallow depth of field, although it also has to do with like sharpness and color, all the rendering that happens from Leica glass, but mostly depth of field. And that's something worth to bring up in regards to the Leica Q2 because it's a 28mm lens, so you're not going to really be able to isolate subjects as you would with a longer focal length, and trying to create that isolated depth of field look with subjects in street photography specifically, it was really hard to do. This isn't a fault of the camera or the lens, it's just the way, lens optics work. So to create that really shallow depth of field, you're gonna have to get really close to what you're photographing. I think the street portrait I took was probably the best representation of that Leica look, but still, I would have had to get a lot closer to make for more isolation to the background. But I can see the transition from him to the background is almost seamless. There's this dreamy look to it, and you have that depth of field, but all of this retained sharpness. I found it kind of tricky to incorporate this into street photography. That's why I'm showing a street portrait here. Shooting wide open isn't something I really do all that much in street photography, but having some time with the Q2 and the f1.7 Sumilux, I wanted to see what it looks like and how much this Q2 demonstrates that Leica look. And I'd have to say it's going to be really hard to create that look with this camera, simply because you're going to have to get really close. So one of Leica's highlighted features on the Q2 is this digital zoom, which basically is a crop mode for 35, 50mm, and 75mm focal lengths. And it basically brings up frame lines for each one. It's a pretty interesting feature that I haven't seen in other cameras before. There really isn't anything special about it other than the fact that it just brings up these frame lines in the EVF and adds an initial crop to your photo. I'd wish that instead of the frame lines, they just brought up, 50mm, 75mm, or 35mm frames within the EVF. But if they were to do that, they would have had to improve a lot on the EVF itself, which quite honestly has aged poorly. It's a 3.69 dot EVF, and there's a ton of cameras right now on the market, a third of the price, that are if not the same quality or better. Now, I can't fault the camera for having technology get better over time, but I don't know, I feel like Leica would have been able to make this EVF a lot better than what it is. The EVF isn't unusable, of course, but trying to use those 50 or 75mm frame lines can be a little bit difficult. I do get what Leica tried to do here. You have a 28mm lens, this camera with all of this resolution, why not add these frame lines for those who like to use longer focal lengths? Leica Q2 offers a decent amount of customization options. If you like using back button focusing like I do, you're out of luck with this camera because there is no option to set the back button to autofocus. The only options for this back button are the digital zoom, AEL, AFL, or AE, AFL. You can set it to autofocus lock, but that's not quite the same. It's also not really tactile enough of a button to be used for back button focusing either. Pretty much every other digital camera I've owned in the past allows for this button to be programmed to autofocus, so you can do back button focusing. For whatever reason, Leica doesn't allow it on the Q2. So I've strictly been using standard shutter AF and setting this button to auto exposure and autofocus lock. To be fair, I think this is the most common way people set up their cameras, so I honestly have no issue using a camera like this. Another annoyance is the D-pad. It's kind of the placement of the D-pad. It's right where your hand digs into the back of the camera when you hold it. This is a problem a lot of digital cameras face, but I would have thought Leica would be smart enough to allow you to lock the functionality of the D-pad, because this happens all the time when you accidentally hit something on the D-pad and adjust something you don't want. That was certainly the case with the Q2. I like to use a centered autofocus point a lot of the time, and there's no way for me to lock this in place. So there were many times where I would accidentally push into the D-pad and move my focus point off center. It's really annoying when it happens, and it can honestly lead to missing a critical shot. Being able to lock my focus point is something I can do on my Fuji and Sony, but surprisingly can't on this Leica. On a more positive note though, the function button here is really useful, and I wish more camera brands adopted this feature. I can program this function button to do a maximum of 8 different things, and I found that to be really useful. I could switch from this button being my autofocus mode switch, or switching it to the digital frame lines. I found it really useful when I was shooting street photography, and I think it really makes up for the lack of custom buttons. Now, we talked about the Leica look. There's also the Leica Feel. And I can honestly say that it does feel really good using this camera. I feel like the camera has the perfect weight to it, and the ergonomics are honestly not that bad. It doesn't look like much, and I was a little skeptical of how this, concaved indent into the back of the camera would feel, using the camera for, all day shooting. And I really had no issues. The shutter speed dial and the aperture ring are just incredibly snappy. They have this nice responsiveness to them. I also noticed that high level of construction in the manual focusing. It's incredibly smooth to adjust the manual focus, and I just feel like I have so much control over it. I can precisely move the focus knob the smallest amount, and the camera will respond really well to those micro adjustments.
Can I take your photo? How you doing? Have a good one.
I don't want to make this video way too long, so in this next section I will be quickly going over some things I liked and some things I don't like with the Leica Q2. Loading up the camera is incredibly fast. It's almost instant in the time it takes to flip the turn on switch and have the camera ready to take photos. So that's a huge plus for someone who likes to do street photography and for preserving the battery life of the Q2. Speaking of battery life, it's pretty bad, but I was still able to make one battery last me most of half a day of shooting, and that was with me turning the camera on and off to preserve the battery. I think if you were to buy a Leica Q2, I think it's a necessity to get another battery. Maybe this is all of Leica's evil plan to get you to spend $285 on a battery. There's also no way to charge this camera in the field via, a cable to an external battery source. So I can't plug this camera into a computer or, my Anchor power bank. I feel like for a camera that's sort of marketed as this documentary style camera, being able to charge it in the field just with a cable would have made a lot of sense, but you can't. You have to charge the battery with Leica's battery charger. Now, swapping the battery out of the camera is oddly very satisfying. I thought the autofocus of the Q2 was really fast enough for street photography in my opinion. On really bright sunny days, I found the EVF a little bit difficult to look through. The details sort of get lost in the high contrast of everything due to that light. So I sometimes wish that this EVF could go a little bit brighter. The Leica Q2 feels really durable. This thing is built like a tank, and of course, since this is a rental unit, I'm not gonna go out there testing how durable the camera is. I have the sense that it's going to take a beating and last a really long time. Now, a lot of people will want to compare this to the X100V, and I think that's just not a fair comparison to make, and it's not fair to either of these cameras and their feelings. I think the only real similarity is that they both have fixed lenses and they're both not for everyone. I can't really recommend a $6,000 camera to anyone, nor can I even recommend a $1,400 fixed lens camera to everyone. These purchasing decisions are things you're gonna have to make for yourself and how much you enjoy using these cameras and whether or not it's worth it. It's why you should try to get your hands on one of these cameras and using it first before you go out buying something. If I had all the disposable income in the world, would I buy a Leica Q2? I honestly wouldn't, because I don't really like shooting 28mm all that much. I really like to shoot 50mm for most of my street photography. But yeah, if anything, this Leica Q2, shooting with it, it's kind of made me want to try out a Leica M10 or M11. That's a little bit dangerous, but we'll save that for another day. All in all, none of these cameras will make you take better photos. It's really about the experience you have using them and how much you enjoy it. I'm just one person, and my opinions don't really hold a lot of value. Honestly, you have to go out and use a camera for you to really know if it's going to work for you. That said, I hope some of my impressions added some insight to someone thinking about purchasing a Leica Q2. So if you do have any more questions for me about my experience using it, don't be afraid to leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Alright guys, I'm gonna return back to reality, pack this camera up, and continue to use all the camera gear I own and love. Bye.